It's time to start. Warm welcome to all participants to a seminar on global context of race and the development of race and racism in Central and Eastern Europe, organized by Multiculturalism and Migration Observatory in partnership with University of Sheffield and Leverhulme Trust. Last month, we organized with Bolaji a seminar on race and racism in contemporary Poland. And this month, we decided to enlarge this discussion and to look more broadly into the whole region. More details about today's seminar and our distinguished speakers will be provided by the moderator of the seminar and its initiator and organizer, Bolaji Balagan. I'll just want to say before I pass the mic to Bolaji that this seminar will be recorded as all of our observatory seminar, and it will be available through our YouTube channel. All persons except the speakers will be muted and their videos will be stopped by me, and all participants may use chat to ask questions anytime during the seminar, and these questions may be addressed to all of the participants or to a moderator. And then also the participants will have the opportunity to ask questions personally during Q&A. So without further ado, I'd like to pass now to Bolaji.
Thank you very much, Conrad. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for this important discussion about bringing the global context of race into dialogue with the development of race and racism in Central and Eastern Europe. As we all know, race is multi-sided and cannot be fully understood from one particular angle. We have witnessed its impact on COVID-19 globally and also in the killing of George Floyd in the US, which triggered protests across the world, even in unusual places like Central and Eastern Europe. This suggests to me that there is a need to look at race outside and beyond the common examples of race and racism, namely the US, the UK, and largely Western Europe. There's a need to look at racism from a global perspective within which the nations of Central and Eastern Europe cannot remain blind spots. I think to have a better understanding of race and racism, we need to think about the UK, the US, in conjunction with the emergence of race and racism in Central and Eastern Europe, former Soviet states, and contemporary Russia. So to help us to unpack this a lot further, I have four amazing speakers that have used their work to try and understand the way race and racism work globally. So to start with, we have Marius Turda, who is a professor in 20th century Central and Eastern European Biomedicine at Oxford Brookes University. Marius is a fellow of the Royal Historical Society and fellow of the Galton Institute. His publications include Religion, Evolution, and Heredity, published in 2019. Historicizing Race with Marius Sophia Quine, published in 2018. And The History of Eugenics in East Central Europe, published in 2015. Up next, we have Nicole Hemia, who is a professor of cinematic art at the University of Southern California in Los Angeles in the US. She is the author of many other publications, among many other publications, of the monographs TV Socialism, published in 2016, and The Identity Games, published in 2009, and the articles, very, very important, famous articles, Whiteness in Post-Socialist Eastern Europe, The Time of the Gypsies, The End of Race, published in 2015, and Postcolonial Media Studies in Post-Socialist Europe, published in 2014. And thirdly, we have Sonny Rockchan, who is an assistant professor of Slavic and East European Studies, and also Sonny is the director of European Studies at the University of Cincinnati in the US. She's the co-author of Roma Rights and Civil Rights, published in 2020, and co-editor of Chinese Migrants in Eastern Europe and Central Asia, published in 2011. And Sonny is currently finishing a book project that traces the uses of Blackness and racial discourse in the Balkans. And lastly, we will have Ian Law, who is an emeritus professor of racism and ethnicity studies at the University of Leeds. And Ian is also an honorary professor at Nelson Mandela University in South Africa. He is the author of many books, many books that I have used myself to understand race and racism. And those books include Racism, Red Racisms, Racism in Communist and Post-Communist Contexts, Mapping Global Racisms, published in 2012, and co-author of Racism, Post-Colonialism, Europe, published in 2009. Also, Ian is the editor of Mapping Global Racism at Palgrave Macmillan. So that was just a brief introduction of our 4 speakers. Just a quick housekeeping rule. Each speaker will have roughly about 5 minutes to reflect on the ways in which we can bring the global context of race into dialogues with race and racism in Central and Eastern Europe. And then straight after that, we will go into Q&A. So I will encourage all our audience to kindly submit their questions through the chat panel, and I'll try and group those questions together and then put them to our panel to discuss during the Q&A. So without taking too much time, we now give way to Marius to start off. Marius, over to you.
Good evening, everyone. It is a real pleasure. And thank you for inviting me to take part in this conversation. I look forward to both to hearing what my esteemed colleagues have to say and also to the questions. Now, your first question, Bolaji, was whether race and racism are historically global. I would say immediately, they're not only historically global, but also globally relevant. Now, regarding the history of eugenics and the understanding of eugenics, a field I've worked for the past 25 years, it's very interesting when it comes to East Central Europe that it's been marginalized for so long. Only for the past, say, 2 decades, we've started seeing monographs coming out. There was one book on Romania and one book on Poland in the early 2000s. Before, there was literally very little, if anything, on the history of eugenics in East Central Europe. And here I include Austria. The first book on Austrian eugenics, a proper book on Austrian eugenics, came out in 2004. So you can imagine that in the 1990s, when the field opened up and people started pouring into East Central Europe to study various subjects, eugenics was not the one that was picked up. Not even in the first global and comparative histories of eugenics done by people like Adams, included Germany, included France, included Britain and the US, but didn't include any East European countries. Or you have people like Nancy Steppen, who actually looked at Latin America, opened up the field to Latin America and the global South. But there was nothing similar happening with respect to East Central Europe. So it was a very difficult and troublesome period. However, to my surprise, and I suppose to the surprise of many, eugenics in East Central Europe has not only been very powerful, but actually survived very well throughout the 20th century. It survives under communism and it continues to impact modes of thinking, practices and societal behavior towards people with disability, towards people of color, towards ethnic minorities such as the Roma. So there is an imperative need to bring the conversation about race, racism and eugenics to East Central Europe, and then in return to use the Central European example to critique certain ideal types that emerged from the scholarship on race and racism and eugenics more broadly, that only looked at key countries. So you have that. Now, ironically, one of the interesting things I noted when I started this is that the narrative created by the East Europeans themselves about the history of eugenics was immediately adopted by the West Europeans. East Europeans themselves, people in Poland or in Hungary or Romania, and particularly physicians or historians of medicine who came from the medical professions, were very keen to completely erase, suppress, and marginalize any eugenic contribution their profession might have had during the interwar period. So they did that, of course, very easily by discussing things about health of the nation, or the survival of the family, or the future of the country, within a narrative that, of course, they created since the 19th century onwards. But that in itself was one of resistance, because, of course, as with race and racism, the Western Europeans were racist, and they had racial hygiene, and they had concentration camps, and they were imperialists. But the East Europeans were just victims of history. So within that narrative, a lot of the stuff survived unchecked, unchallenged, and historiographically unchecked, which was really a problem for me when I started, because I simply did not have, the shoulders of the giants to sit on to continue the field. So I literally, in some cases, had to start everything from scratch. So then what you discover is that you have an important, very internationalized eugenic movement in East Central Europe. Before 1914, before the First World War, the Hungarians were literally amongst the most prominent, internationally speaking, in terms of their eugenic ideals. After the First World War in the 1920s, you have the Poles and the Czechs. The Poles and the Czechs figure prominently internationally in terms of their eugenic figures, eugenic contributions, eugenic institutes, and the type of eugenics they promoted that coincided so well and it worked fantastically productively with the ideal of the nation state, both in the Czech case and in the Polish case. You also had a very interesting narrative and direction, of course, which in the case of Romania, Hungary, or the independent state of Croatia, led to the Holocaust and genocide and deportations of the Roma and the Jews. So all of these things, of course, were in a way completely sidestepped by the national narrative, by the canonical reading of the past. So you had a discussion about race and racism in Eastern Europe, of course, even during communism, when the interwar period was analyzed and portrayed as an imperialist, a fascist, and of course, the Germans tried to impose their ideas onto the East Europeans. So you all had this all the time, but there was always about decontextualizing it, exoticizing it, and not taking any personal responsibility. Until, of course, the 1990s, when the discussion about the Holocaust became very prominent in Eastern Europe. But you can't read any book about the Holocaust in Eastern Europe if it doesn't take into account both the global, but also the regional and the national discussion and understanding of race and racism. And within that, all the negative excesses done in the name of human betterment, racial betterment, eugenics, the protection of the nation, and all the laws and practices they applied. Now, as it happened, as you well know, in the 1950s, there was a short, brief period of time between 48 and like 51, 52, when East Europeans were trying to save eugenics by name, not by practice. By practice, it survived very well, but by name. But then, of course, with under the pressure from the Soviet Union with the Lysenkoism, it was completely eliminated from the public and scientific language. However, most of the people who were very active in the interwar period in the eugenic fields, both as physicians, health reformers, sexual advocates, church activists, social assistance activists and so on and so forth. All of them survived and managed, of course, to offer their services and ideas to the nascent socialist and then communist discussion about the nation and about health and about society in general. To give you a very interesting example, if you look at those who were trialed in the 1950s for war crimes in countries such as Hungary or Romania, they were trialed because in some cases, like in the Hungarian case, they were blatantly anti-Semitic and racist, even by the standards of the time. So it was very easy to, in the case of Romania, because of the Holocaust, but not because of the eugenic beliefs. So you have someone in Romania who was a very famous eugenicist and who conducted experiments on patients in hospitals during the Second World War. And he's not trialed for medical experimentation. He's not trying for his eugenic practices and beliefs. He's trialed because he was a member of a particular political party. So that's a very interesting way how they managed to, in a way, simply push it completely outside history, as it were. And as if it never happened. East Central Europe disappeared completely in the discussion about eugenics. And then it was only recently that it re-emerged, and now the entire spectrum of ideas, practices, personalities are presented to the scientific community. The population at large, they know absolutely nothing about it. They may know something about race and racism if they're 17 or 18, but they would have absolutely no idea about the eugenic past of the country. I've done this experiment in Hungary, I've done it in Romania, in Croatia, in Bulgaria, in Greece. They will not know anything about it. It's never taught in schools, it's never discussed publicly. They will know something about the Holocaust, they will know something about racism, past and present, but they would be absolutely shocked to find out that actually there was a eugenic society in Romania. And when you tell them, actually, there were 5 eugenic societies in Romania, they absolutely got smart. So apart from the conversation that we ought to have in terms of scholarly approaches, in terms of how we can make this conversation global, about how can we integrate East Central Europe into the overall debate, there is this absolutely stringent and, in my opinion, even more important task we have is the education of the general public. Because, as we know, eugenic type of thinking survived very well to the point is now completely assimilated by the majorities in this country. So they speak eugenic language, they use eugenic metaphors, they use suggest eugenic practices without even realizing that actually this is a problem and this is eugenics. They simply don't have at all the realization, because this has never been addressed publicly, debated on the main channels, by the main publications, and the general public doesn't know it. So it is very important that this type of conversation that you initiated today are brought wider to the public, and then the conversation can continue. I think I should stop now. I think I've overstepped my time.
That's all right. Thank you very much, Marius, for setting that out. I think that's really nicely set out to actually for us to have an idea, and one of the reasons why, not only eugenics, but race as well as racism, they're not fully, they're not in public discourse in a way in Central and Eastern Europe. So without taking too much time, we now go to Nicole to give us some thoughts on most likely whiteness, which is going to be really interesting. Nicole, over to you.
Hi, sure. I certainly can talk about whiteness. I'm also very happy to be here and really glad we're talking about race at last. I'm a bit of an odd one out as I look at the other participants' credentials, because the main thrust of my work is not on race. I'm not in the social sciences. I come from media studies, communications, cultural studies. And in fact, I discovered the centrality of race to understanding the entire history and the epistemological ordering of the East European region by way of post-colonial studies and gender studies that article that you mentioned, Balaji, was actually published in the early 2000s. And it was my attempt to shine the light on whiteness as a foundational category at the heart of nationalism. And it's remarkable that, you know, it's being read again because it was published in a, you know, not very well circulated book. Obviously, it's very hard for us to ignore race at this moment. But the contradictions remain: the silence about race, the refusal, the rejection, the resistance to acknowledging the history of racism, eugenics, as Marius mentioned, is still remarkable even at this historical moment. And it continues to intrigue me how robustly the region insists on a kind of historical exemption to race and racism. And this is in a region that has been very, very obviously marked by migration, constantly contested borders, ethnic mixing, ethnic strife, not to mention the Holocaust, the history of eugenics, relentless and systematic discrimination against the Roma, as we know, and other minorities. And most recently, just a couple of decades after the end of socialism, most countries of the region have returned to a form of illiberal autocratic governance that is very much based on the idea of ethnic purity, achieved by excluding and demonizing immigrants and racialized others. So race is constantly on the agenda at the same time as it's completely invisible and covered up and folded into other categories, most often ethnicity and religion and sometimes language. So I'm very interested in these contradictions, that race and racial difference can be active, operational categories that truly permeate every sphere of social life. And yet from the inside, if you talk to people in the street, as well as often academic scholars, public personalities, journalists, race is dismissed as irrelevant as a category. There's a kind of moral transparency around it. And as Marius said, a kind of idea of righteous nationalism, often underscored by a historical victimhood, serves as the overarching foundation of understanding difference. At this moment, when Black Lives Matter and protests around the world for racial justice have erupted, it's very, very hard to sustain these contradictions and continue to erase whiteness. The question is how we bring it into public consciousness. How do we continue these conversations in a way that will have an actual effect? And I agree with Marius that education is the key. It's just how do we go about it? One obvious way, and I think we're all in the business of doing this, is the historicizing of race and whiteness as categories. So I'm very interested in, and I'm engaged in several projects of historicizing whiteness and race with many excellent colleagues around Europe and Eastern Europe and Northern America, that look at the histories of race in terms of war and exploration and diplomacy in representation. That's obviously the area where I dabble most frequently, from films and music to artifacts to everyday language and television, these expressions of banal nationalism, as well as intellectual and academic discourses and theories. So this is what I'm most interested in exploring. For instance, in the history of television, there is virtually no writing, no work on how television has perpetuated a kind of raceless nationalism and how this has endured into the post-socialist era. Obviously, we also have to globalize race and whiteness, not in a way that that erases local histories or that appropriates or subordinates the specificity of these local histories, and some of them are very local, sub-regional to global, which are mostly Western Eurocentric paradigms of race and whiteness. Obviously, the kind of color line or the kind of history of slavery that determines the dialogue about race in the United States will apply to some extent, but will not apply in other extents, and others can talk about this. So we have to be very careful about not imposing paradigms wholesale on the region. However, we do need to acknowledge and trace the global history of racism to resist the claim to racial exceptionalism that we encounter. I'm very interested in, I continue to be very interested in, and I'm just going to throw out some ideas, perhaps for further discussion, on how race intersects with class and gender in the East European region, and how these intersections at certain historical junctures define nationalism and define the kinds of discourses that cover up race and racism. It seems to be that masculinity plays a really, really important role, and a very specific role in the discourses of victimhood that underscore nationalism. And I think when we look at the history of race and racism during socialism, there is also a very important history of class, and obviously under socialism, how the working class and the Marxist class relations have helped reorganize public understanding, and how these categories of class have been dismissed. I'm also very interested in the contemporary, what I think about as a leap forward from a kind of proto-racist, proto-racial, pre-racial understanding of race, as well as gender, to post-racist and post-gender and post-feminist understanding of these categories that seems to be taking hold in Eastern Europe. A sort of colorblindness without the history of breaking down, educating about, and understanding the role of race, and in an analogical fashion, the role of gender. That is a kind of opportunistic and often cynical borrowing from other ideals, other models of neoliberal capitalism developed elsewhere. So those are just some of the ideas that I would be happy to hear about and discuss. Obviously, this is just the beginning of the conversation, so I'll stop here.
Thank you very much, Nicole. I think that was very, very brilliant. I quite like the way you move on from eugenics gradually into whiteness, into the television, and the way it's actually being used to develop national identity. It's great. I will have some sort of follow-up questions, and maybe later on, especially looking at gender, which is quite an interesting point that you're making there. So I'll just move quickly on now to Sonny to give us the Balkan take on racial discourse in the region. Sonny, over to you now.
So I'd like to say that I also somewhat accidentally happened to the study of race, and it was the result of writing a dissertation, trying to do work that was obviously focused on difference, but I didn't have the language of race. My education as a Slavic and East European studies scholar, with someone with a PhD in Slavic languages and literatures, I didn't have the language. And so I began this study using the frames of ethnicity and nationalism, and then kind of evolved into talking about race. So I've looked at Chinese migrant communities, I've looked at other studies of migration, but I've also, now I'm working on a project, I'm very deep in the project, almost near the end of a project of looking at Blackness and what it means within the context of former Yugoslav states. And now the study has been an interesting one to engage with simply because there's so much pushback and there's so much reluctance to think about that as a valid category for analysis within the region. But I'd like to start out this presentation with an excerpt from an interview that I just recently received from my research assistant. And I will sort of depart from there in the next 3 minutes to talk about how I'm engaging with Blackness in this project. So I'm going to go ahead and start there. And I should say before I actually play it that the interview is in BCS, but I will tell you what the essence of it is. Sorry, I'm going to close my window. I'll tell you what the essence of it is simply because I think it's important to let the person speak in his own language in the way that he normally would, and then I can tell you what he says. So this question that he is answering is in response to what does the term Black mean in relation to a person? So again, my work, I'm really trying to figure out if these are active categories. And I'm happy to say that they are active categories and they actually have meaning. So let's go to this recording.
Što ti pitam, da ti pitam kao kada kažem da neko zemlju i tu stvari spadaju
Po meni iskreno da kažeš nekom ti si crn, to je uvreda.
Aha.
Znaš. Ona je čitam mnogo.
Ok, da ti pitam.
Jer ne znam, ima neko koji se uvredi kad mu kažeš, vidi kako si crn, da. I to je po meni, ajde da kažem uvreda.
Okay, so just to sort of give you a sense of what's going on. So he's asked, what does the term Black mean in relation to a person? And I should say, through the different interviews, I'm getting a variety of answers. Some are in relation to if a person is good or bad, but more often than not, the responses that I'm getting are in relation to categories for the self or other people. So he says that in response to this question, what does it mean to be Black? He goes, you know, people around the world are dark. There are dark-skinned people everywhere because people around the world have mixed. And so he says there are dark-skinned people everywhere and not Black. And so he says that potentially calling someone Black is offensive, and therefore we need to recognize it as offensive or as something that is negative. And so it's from this point of understanding, thinking about race, is I look at the category of Blackness as a manifestation of race in these particular spaces. And as my work is very much revolved around looking at comparison or intersecting points from the African-American experience and Romani communities, this is where I start. So I'm interested in how the notion of Black and therefore Blackness maps onto East European spaces and informs Eastern Europe regarding race. By understanding Black, I think it's really important to say that yes, we have primarily, dominantly, this working category of Black that's informed by transatlantic slave trade. Yes, but in engaging with Michelle Imright's work, I'm looking for broader categories of Black and what does it mean to be Black. And if we can situate it or take it away from one specific context, we start to get a very rich definition of what Black is and what Blackness means, to the point where in my own research, I've come to 3 different definitions or 3 different categories of Blackness. And I start first and foremost with this idea of the physical or epidermal, simply because I think that taking race or taking physical appearance away from the context of race is deeply problematic. And in fact, I'm happy to note that there's a lot of writing happening about this as a form of white supremacy, because you have to see my difference to see me. And if you don't see my difference, then that means you are enacting this idea that there was only one way to be. And so I start my study of Blackness with the physical and epidermal, and then I look at situational to say that Blackness can code very differently depending on the context in which it is placed. So that means that you can have Eastern European Blackness and Western whiteness, allowing for this idea of race or Blackness and race to be really specific to the region in which it's contained. I take very seriously what Aniko is saying, that it's very important to not simply take categories and place them onto places that are historically inaccurate, but I also think it's important to look for intersections. And then I'm not going to talk so much about emancipatory Blackness, but know that I see that it's there, and that Blackness doesn't always have to be an uvreda or an offense. So in my own work, I'm looking for transatlantic connections. Like I said, I looked first to Chinese migrants. My most recent work, Roma rights and civil rights, is definitely looking for those intersections. Putting at the center these ideas of race, these ideas of Blackness, but also struggles and social movements that allow for potentially some kind of aim to emancipatory potential. And then finally, I think that my time is probably just about up because I spent so much time in the beginning with the recording. But one of the other pieces of my study of Blackness that I think is can be pretty productive is this idea of cultural practice, or where we can see Blackness in film, as Aniko said, or in sort of music and other types of entertainment. And in this last slide here, I have this wonderful piece of cultural information or music here that I found of Chuck D and a Roma brass band, Bojana Ristic, it shouldn't be Bojana Ristic, singing about the face of freedom. And so I'm really interested to see not just looking at Blackness as uvreda or some kind of offense or something that is negative, but rather where we can find our solidarities and move forward to something else. So I will stop there. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Sonny. That's quite on time. That's really good. Thanks very much for that. I like the idea of going from physical to situation to emancipation. It's quite interesting because in my own study in Poland, this is something that I've noticed quite a lot that comes up quite often in the discussion I have with people. It's quite interesting. Right, quickly now, we'll go on to Ian Lott to give us his take in a very global context. Hopefully we can move on a bit now into Russia. Ian, over to you.
Thank you very much, Balaji, and welcome to everyone. Hello. Very interesting to hear my contributions from my colleagues, which raise many thoughts and questions in my mind, and I might try and pick up a couple of those as we go along. I suppose one of the most important things I've got to say is I think in this debate we need a much less one-sided account of racial Europeanization. It was interesting to see Sunny put up the quote from David Goldberg about racial Europeanization, but it is often told as one where as if Eastern Europe didn't happen or didn't appear, and we need a much less one-sided account. To really provide a much better understanding of global racialization. Because what we have at the moment is a very limited, partial, uneven account of world racism. And there are many contexts where, as Marius was referring to in relation to eugenics, where there is a denial or where there is very little research being done. And others where we see a huge avalanche of material and research. So we have a very uneven picture of race and racism. And if we look at some of the main accounts that have tried to take a hold of global racism, what they often do is miss out this region completely, miss out China, miss out Russia, miss out parts of the global south and the Pacific region. So we have huge gaps in our understanding of racism. And another way of coming at this question of our understanding is to look at what international monitoring of racism is doing. If we look, for example, of the work of the UN Special Rapporteur on contemporary forms of race and racism, the post that carries out country visits around the globe and is our global international monitor. I checked back today on the report on country visits from that rapporteur, and over the last 10 years, there's only been one visit to one country in Eastern Europe, and that was Hungary in 2011. And there are so many other contexts where we see very little. I've done work in many contexts and countries, but I might just pick up another one, which is Morocco. How often do we see books on racism in Morocco? And there is, one a very good one in English, but very little. Similarly on Russia, and thanks for that prompt, Balaji. Certainly Russia was one of the ways in which I started to look at, to come into looking at the debate over racism in communist and post-communist contexts. And you referred kindly to my book on Red Racisms, and there I was looking at racism, the development of, historically, the development of racism, the construction of racial states, and then contemporary forms of racism today, not only in Russia, but also in China and Cuba, and 4 countries in Central and Eastern Europe. And I think what is astonishing is that that whole set of contexts has failed to inform our understanding of global racialization. So we have a theory, a foundational understanding that racism is a product of Western modernity. Now, of course, that is a big part of the story, but racism is also a product of modernities around the world. And I prefer to understand this in my own writing as what I'd call polyracism, where we have multiple origins of racism in different contexts, production of different types of modernity with different types of racial states. And I think when I'm starting to look at a particular country, I'm always asking myself, well, what is the state trying to do to racialize groups in that country? Is it trying to expel them? Is it trying to exterminate them? Is it trying to segregate them? Is it trying to assimilate them? And certainly if we look at the process that I've called racial proletarianization in Central and Eastern Europe, what we had were states trying to make invisible groups like the Roma and others with claims to ethnic minority and racialized identities. And that process of racial proletarianization, I think, we can see if we look at a comparison, say, of Nazi and communist racial logics about the Roma. For the Nazis, they were an Aryan group who'd mixed with inferior races. They'd been reduced to extreme poverty. They had a nomadic lifestyle, and they were a major threat to racial purity. Whereas the Soviet logic of racial proletarianization that clearly informed thinking in many of the countries in Central and Eastern Europe was that they were a biocultural group. And the history of eugenics is such an important part of this story. But as also, I think Marius was indicating, we can't see racism as just a history of ideas. It's also about processes of racial governmentality and the way in which states enforce and regulate their populations. So for the Roma, the logic was to see them, to destroy culture, to destroy identity, to make them invisible, to make them disappear into these new socialist and post-socialist societies. And that suppression, that process of invisibilizing, accompanied that denial of racism. And for so many countries around the world, we see states taking a position that says very clearly, racism is not here. It's over there. It's somewhere else, or indeed it's just over. So I think we need to be highly critical of the way in which states are presenting their rhetoric about race. We need to carry out a forensic examination of the whole race-making web of nation building that is the history of all the Central and Eastern European states, where ideas of biocultural differentiation, ideas of myths of shared descent, the drawing of boundaries of inclusion have been at the heart of the building of nation states. So if racialization is at the heart of the building of Central and Eastern European states, then we need to move forward to understand the ways in which that is informing and being reworked and reinvented in contemporary contexts. And maybe I should leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ian. Thank you, Ian. I think that was very, very good. We're coming gradually to the end, and I've not even started asking all my questions yet, but I will try my best and group these questions together. It's most likely that we will not be able to take questions from the audience. I'm really sorry about that, but I just want everyone to just reflect, just really briefly on probably roughly 2 or 3 minutes each, so that we can finish around the time that we promised that we're going to finish. How is the idea of race related to the nation building and identity, national identity in particular, in Central and Eastern Europe? I will quickly go in the same order. Marius, if you can just briefly just talk a little bit more about how the idea of race is building into national identity and nation building.
I personally see it centrally located at the interstices that generated the creation of the modern nation state in East Central Europe. Ian put it very nicely at the end. If we look at the logic of the nation state in East Central Europe, we have all the ingredients that relate to racialization. We have exclusion, we have marginalization, we have whiteness, we have theories and narratives about the past that presuppose that the majority are elective, have a destiny. They meant to have a state only for them. In other words, Poland only for the Polish, Romania only for the Romanians, and so on and so forth. So to not take this into account and not to read it, to historicize it, like I tried in my book, and as Enrico said, you have to historicize race in order to understand the national tradition, the historical underpinnings of it, is unfeasible at the moment. It's simply unfeasible. We ought to move towards the lines described by my precedent speakers, that's hopefully that's going to happen with the current scholarship. So I don't see East Central Europe in any way different than other parts of the world when it comes to imbibing its nationalist rhetoric with racist tropes. I'll pass on the baton now to my colleagues to continue with these thoughts.
I think I'm next. Yeah, I agree. There is no essential difference between the way in which race and racism become building blocks of nationalism, not on a theoretical level, probably not on a wholesale historical level. However, there is something specific, maybe in terms of scale and degree, that is specific to East European nationalisms, and that is that they were very unstable. That nationalisms, because they didn't organically evolve from imperial adventures, although empires were present, but they were different, contiguous. We don't have to go into that. The kind of automatic superiority of races, the family tree of races never quite evolved. These nationalisms have always had to deny a really high degree of hybridity, the changing of borders, ethnic mixing. So nationalisms had to produce very, very strongly performative ideas for delineating identities among identities that were actually very, very similar. And we see this in a lot of cultural discourses. And I think whiteness and assimilation to an aspiration to a kind of Western European, very Eurocentric whiteness through cultural means, because those are what were available, actually served the purpose of purifying, of providing a basis of superiority for these nations, for their national narratives. And it's very interesting how this baseline of whiteness, of purity, is constantly performed and contested, tried out, often in relation to other forms of hybridized identities, the Caribbean, Native Americans, for instance. There's a whole history of assimilating or performing Native American identities. There is an assimilation or an establishing of cultural solidarity with African American slaves in the United States during communism. So those are the kind of leakages where you see that whiteness and racial purity doesn't quite work. It is called upon as the kind of umbrella of legitimacy, but it's constantly leaking and needs to be reformed through these performative identities. That's it. I stopped.
Okay, so because the answers that have already come before are already rich, I'd like to start, give an anecdote on some level. I'm watching a film for a project that I'm working on right now about the Chinese in Serbia. And this man who's Chinese, who grew up in Serbia his whole entire life, someone turns to him and says, "Oh, you speak Serbian so well," right? And how many times have I heard the same thing? How many times when I travel around? And I mean, not to always take this conversation back to physical appearance, but I do think it's really important because this idea of who belongs, who gets to participate, who gets to define the nation is front and center to these conversations. So as long as there's no space for difference, no space, and the nation is one thing, the national identity is formed in a particular way, or was formed, and it continues to be manufactured and created in the same way.
If I could just pick up on one of the points I was talking about earlier on about monitoring, international monitoring of racism. When we see a lot of the reports that are done by the European Council on Racism and the European Network Against Racism, the Activist Network, and also the UN, this whole discussion about race and nation building is completely absent from those reports. It's as if these things didn't happen. So we get a focus on racism in the media or racism in schools or the labour market. But this whole fundamental story at the core of the making of national states is absent. So it's fundamentally important that we do that. And just to bring in one other region, which is the Baltic States, I've certainly looked very closely at the formation of race identities and national identities in Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. And there's some very good work being done also on that and overlapping with work on eugenics by Bjorn Felder. And he talks about the ways in which, for example, in Estonia, intellectuals saw race as a new means in their national struggle to symbolize the nation. So clearly we have different groups of people in particular elite positions working to construct a discourse of shared identity, drawing on biocultural ideas, and then using those to sharpen distinctions and sharpen regulation. And you can see the link from that earlier nationalism in the Baltic states from the late 1800s onwards, informing what's happening there now, because those states don't see themselves as racist. They see themselves as open and multicultural, with no racist history at all, with no institutional racism, with no structural racism. They see racism as just being about a few incidents that might happen when you get a couple of Nazi thugs in the street. That's it. I mean, how poor is the understanding of racism in many parts of that region? And that's why I particularly thank Balaji for bringing this whole debate, hopefully to much wider public.
Thank you very much, Ian. Thanks very much, everyone. We've actually gradually come to the end of the conversation. It's just like I'm about to start enjoying it, but because it's weekend as well, I really don't want to take too much of your time. I know you want to go back to, enjoying your nice weekend. Just a final thought. I mean, this can just be thrown out. It doesn't have to go in a particular order. Just a final thought from anyone from the panel. Well, going forward, because I mean, as we mentioned before, this is the beginning. So going forward, just a final thought from everyone, please.
I'd like to see a much better systematized account made available on the web about racism in each of these states. We just don't have it. I'll leave it there.
Conrad, you want to say one or two things?
Yeah, I completely agree. And yep. Is it me? Yeah, no, I was just about to say, I completely agree and welcome very much what Ian was saying. It is utterly unfortunate that there's so much information lacking in terms of the international coverage and reports that you have about the region. But one thing is the academic conversation. The other thing is the reports that you should be getting from monitoring racism across the world, and not to have that still about a region and about a big chunk of Europe, it's quite astonishing. So if there is a way forward, at least on this level of political participation and racial justice and getting the public involved, would be to acknowledge that and to have it reported properly. So I think that's one way to end this conversation with.
I think the thing I obsess about is how to communicate and translate. In consequential ways. Because on the one hand, I feel optimistic about a kind of academic opening. Just in the past year, even before COVID and the social justice movements, finally, a kind of recognition of race in Europe began in Eastern and Western Europe. I mean, I have seen some of you and collaborate with some of you in some of these projects. So there is something afoot. At the same time, you know, living in the United States and being from Hungary, I feel like I'm straddling two very different universes. Even with my intellectual colleagues in Hungary, there is so much that needs to be explained and translated, and in a way that is not condescending and not imposing. And it's this kind of grassroots level work that is going to be very, very difficult, and probably particularly if you are from Hungary, because Hungary is not doing well in race relations or democracy. So you know, on the large scale, I think there's progress. The translation in the weeds is where I don't quite know how to progress.
So I should say that the US isn't doing well in race relations either. But seriously, I think that moving beyond the language of bias is fundamental to this conversation. When we go beyond bias and let race be something that is baked into the idea of nation, baked into who people are, we can start to think about race beyond sort of these Soviet and communist ideas of black and white and who is a member of a race, and start to open a conversation a bit more. And I believe that's really fundamental to taking the conversation beyond the 20 so or however many of us are actively really committing our work to this. And it's very difficult. Someone who is very much defined by race, someone who is defined by race as I travel, it's a constant conversation that I have with myself. How do I translate it? How is it made meaningful? But at least it's happening, and hopefully it is able to be sustained. So that's where I'll stop.
Thank you very much, everyone. I'm really pleased that we have this conversation. Conrad, do you want to say a final 1 or 2 words to thank everyone?
One of the most important for me as a scholar who's looking at the situation in Central and Eastern Europe are the issues of illiberal democracy and the processes of race and racism, and how these two things are entangled. And this was very strongly mentioned by Aniko, and I would like to hear more her thoughts on how she sees the development of illiberal democracies in Central and Eastern Europe, and this and racializations of certain groups, and how she sees especially the future of this process, whether she thinks that this will continue or the chances of racialization has been in a way limited. Like, for example, if you look at the case of Poland, we see that the attempt of racializing refugees didn't work out in the last elections. And the government has switched the strategy and started to actually build a moral panic around the issue of LGBTQ. So this is the major so gender issues have become the key dimension. So I wonder what is your view from, sometimes when you are far away, you can see things more clearer than while being in the region. So I wonder what are your thoughts on the region, Poland and other countries?
I can jump in. Very important, very big questions. Thank you, Konrad. You asked about the emergence of illiberal democracies or authoritarian neoliberalisms. There are all kinds of hybrid designations for these very interesting regimes. And it's a whole separate discussion where they come from and how can they be so successful when they are just driven by contradictions. But when it comes to the racialization of nationalism, the overt racialization of attitudes towards non-national citizens, and often national citizens who are racialized, such as the Roma. I think that a very important factor is what I don't know that there's a better word for it, is a propaganda campaign, a very deliberate propaganda campaign where, once again, the Hungarian government is leading the charge, following the Putin playbook, of course. And it has to do with issues of media economy, political economy, on ownership, centralization of ownership around in the hands of oligarchic networks around the Orban in this case. And you see very similar tendencies in all of the East European countries, including Poland. So very interestingly, 3 decades after socialism, we have a kind of ownership structure that it's not that dissimilar to late socialist ownership structures in the midst of media globalization. We have unlimited information. We have access to streaming via the internet that is very much supported by the regulation policies of the European Union. So popular culture can reach anyone who wants to be reached, at the same time as we have an amazing concentration of news sources and the manipulation of news. And it's extremely effective. I mean, we also see this in other countries in right-wing media networks. But it's actually, the main source and the main weapon in the hands of these governments, and particularly the Orban government, in whipping up racist sentiment. Now, it's another question, where does this, how can it be so effective? Where had these sentiments been hiding? How did they survive socialism, where there was no discussion of race, no racial difference, except for, those small groups of students from Africa, the occasional person of color you would see in the streets? Where does racism come from? And this is where we go back to the historical questions of how racism can actually be nurtured in supposedly race-free, transparently white societies that did not participate in colonization. And nationalism was one of the pillars of socialist, populist consolidation, even in late socialism. So here again, we need a historical understanding of how populism has its roots in late socialism, and what the media, the development of media ownership and globalization, how it actually enabled the nurturing of racist sentiment. So that's just one tiny thing. There is a whole lot more to say about this.
I think that gradually brings us to the end, unfortunately, because people are actually gradually leaving now. Once again, thank you everybody for joining us today. It's been really, really interesting. This is just the beginning. Definitely in the coming months, there's going to be more discussion about this that will be coming out. So I will try my best as much as I can to bring these great people back together again, where we'll be talking about something more in a more bigger form and more interesting stuff. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a very nice weekend, and we will reconnect sometime soon. Thank you. Cheers now. Bye-bye.